In 1941, the German Luftwaffe unleashed a mechanical apex predator into the skies over Europe. It was called the Focke-Wulf Fw. To the Allied pilots who had to fight it, it was known by a much darker name, the Butcher Bird. Designed by the brilliant aviation engineer Kurt Tank, the Fw was a brutal, rugged, and heavily armed machine. Unlike the sleek Messerschmitt Bf 109, the Focke-Wulf used a massive radial engine that gave it a terrifying amount of power. It was faster, more agile, and possessed a roll rate that allowed it to easily outmaneuver the early British Spitfires. The German war machine churned out over 20,000 of these lethal aircraft. They were the absolute backbone of the German fighter arm, serving as day fighters, ground attack bombers, and even night hunters. But war is a brutal consumer of machinery. Out of those 20,000 aircraft, only 28 original Fw exist anywhere in the world today. Finding an original Butcher Bird is incredibly rare, but finding the absolute rarest one, a bizarre 1 in 20,000 Frankenstein modification, born out of sheer tactical desperation, requires diving into the hidden corners of military history. This is the story of how the Luftwaffe mutilated their greatest fighter plane to survive, and the lone, impossible survivor that exists today. To understand how desperate the German engineering got by the end of the war, you first have to look at what they were doing to standard Fw. If you visit the Royal Air Force Museum at Cosford in the UK, you will find a beautifully restored Fw. On the surface, it looks like a standard fighter, but this specific plane was actually part of one of the most terrifying, primitive cheat codes of the Second World War, the Mistel system. By 1944, the Luftwaffe was losing the air war. They needed to destroy heavily defended Allied bridges and precision targets, but sending traditional bombers was becoming a suicide mission. So, German engineers essentially invented a massive, analog cruise missile. They took a massive Junkers Ju-88 twin-engine bomber, ripped out the cockpit, and packed the entire nose with thousands of pounds of high explosives. Then, using a massive structure of steel struts, they bolted an Fw. Fighter plane directly on top of the bomber. The pilot sat in the Fw. Controlling both aircraft simultaneously. He would fly this lumbering, highly explosive composite machine toward the target. In the final moments of the attack run, the pilot would aim the massive flying bomb at the target, pull a release lever to detach his fighter plane, and frantically pull away while the unmanned Ju-88 plummeted into the ground, detonating with cataclysmic force. The Cosford Fw. was one of these control ships, captured intact at an airfield in Denmark at the end of the war. It is a stunning piece of desperate engineering, but it is not the rarest Butcher Bird. If you travel to the United States, you can find another incredibly rare survivor at the Smithsonian's Udvar-Hazy Center in Virginia. It's an F-8 ground attack variant that survived the absolute meat grinder of the Eastern Front, likely operating over the blood-soaked fields of Hungary before being captured by US forces. It is a beautiful, heavily armored machine. But again, it is a standard single-seat fighter. It is not unique. To find the true outlier, you have to travel to Germany, specifically to the Military History Museum hidden away at the former RAF Gatow airfield in Berlin. Sitting quietly in the main hangar is an aircraft that forces aviation historians to stop and stare. To understand why this specific plane exists, you have to understand a fatal tactical crisis the Luftwaffe faced in 1944. Early in the war, the howling Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber was the symbol of the German blitzkrieg. But by 1944, the Stuka was a slow, outdated dinosaur. Allied fighters were shooting them out of the sky in staggering numbers. The Luftwaffe commanders realized they had to retire the Stuka and transition those veteran ground attack pilots into the vastly superior Fw. But there was a massive problem. The Stuka was a slow, lumbering dive bomber. The Fw. was a 400-mile-per-hour, highly sensitive, unforgiving fighter plane. If you simply put a Stuka pilot into an Fw. and told him to take off, he was highly likely to crash it. The pilots needed an instructor to teach them how to handle the butcher bird. But the Fw-190 only had one seat. The German engineers at the Arado plant in Warnemünde were given an impossible task: turn a compact, perfectly balanced single-seat fighter into a training aircraft, without building a new plane from scratch. They performed a ruthless, claustrophobic system hack. They took a standard F-8 fighter and ripped out the heavy radio and navigational equipment located deep in the fuselage directly behind the pilot's seat. In this tiny, dark, incredibly cramped void, they hacked out a second mini cockpit. They installed a secondary set of flight controls and welded a strange, bubble-like canopy over the top, so an instructor could sit behind the student. The result was the Fw-190 F-8U-1. It was a claustrophobic nightmare for the instructor, who had limited visibility and was crammed into a space never meant for a human being. But it worked. The instructor could fly with the transitioning Stuka pilots, teaching them how to handle the extreme torque and speed of the butcher bird. They were also occasionally used as high-speed courier planes to rapidly transport high-ranking officers across collapsing front lines. Because it was a desperate, late-war modification, the production numbers were mathematically microscopic. Out of the 20,000 Fw-190s produced during the war, only 20 were ever converted into these two-seater trainers. When Nazi Germany collapsed in May 1945, the Allied forces scrambled to capture as much German aerospace technology as possible. In Grove, Denmark, British forces captured a massive stockpile of grounded Luftwaffe aircraft. Among the sleek fighters and heavy bombers, they found exactly one of these bizarre two-seater Fw-190s sitting on the tarmac. It was a mechanical unicorn. The British recognized its extreme rarity. In September 1945, the legendary Royal Navy test pilot, Lieutenant Commander Eric Winkle Brown, the man who holds the world record for flying the greatest number of different aircraft types in human history, climbed into the cockpit and ferried the two-seater Mutant across the English Channel to RAF Bryce Norton. For decades, this impossible aircraft belonged to the Royal Air Force. It survived being scrapped, it survived the post-war purges of captured equipment, and it was preserved as a totally unique anomaly. Today, it is technically still owned by the RAF, but has been placed on long-term loan to the German Museum in Berlin, allowing it to return to its home soil. Today, there is a thriving industry of aviation enthusiasts building reproduction Fw-190s. There are about 21 modern replicas flying at air shows around the world, letting crowds hear the thunderous roar of the butcher bird's radial engine. But nobody has ever built a replica of the two-seater. The plane sitting in Berlin is the only one of its kind left on planet Earth. It is a monument to a highly specific, terrifying moment in history. It represents the exact moment when an empire realized its legendary weapons were no longer enough, forcing them to violently hack, modify, and mutate their own machines in a desperate bid to survive. The Focke-Wulf Fw was designed to be the ultimate single-seat hunter, but its absolute rarest surviving descendant is a two-seater Frankenstein, a fascinating, quiet ghost of the 20th century's most destructive war.